check. Hey! Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We still have quite a few other people that will be joining us, so thank you for being mindful of others coming in kind of late. Thank you for joining us. This is our June continuing education session, and we're so excited to have Andrea Andre with us, our content editor for the Bulletin and a very vital member of the Garden's communications department. Andrea's got a great presentation for us today to learn more about communications at the Garden, and she's ready for your questions that you have towards the end of the presentation. So without any further delay, I will turn it over to her. Andrea, thank you for being with us. Welcome, 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 welcome. Let's give Andrea a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm actually very excited to be talking to you about content at the Garden, and more specifically the Bulletin. This is a relatively new subject for us here at the Garden. It's only the content development team has only been formally a team at the Garden for the past 2 years. But I wanted to show you a little bit about what we mean by content development. I know this is a lot to take in, but content development is basically the team in charge of optimizing, amplifying, and collaborating to share the Garden story with the public. The way that we do that is that we optimize the Garden's message. We tailor the Garden stories and the Garden messages for each audience that we've identified and for each channel that we have identified. So if we know that there's a certain audience that prefers videos, then we'll tailor our message to that audience and deliver it through a video platform. We also know that an image is worth 1,000 words. So we also tailor messages through images, through the written word, through emails. There's a lot going on, and we make sure that we do what we can to optimize what we're sharing about the Garden so that it reaches the right audiences in the right way, so that it will be absorbed a little bit more. We amplify the message of the Garden. So I'll be talking to you more about the Bulletin today, but there's a lot of different other channels that the Garden has that not a lot of people are aware of, and it keeps growing. So we amplify that message to reach a specific goal, whether it's just building affinity for the Garden, increasing attendance, just letting people know, hey, this plant is in bloom right now, come and visit it. If it's also to drive revenue to the Garden, event attendance, class registration, anything else like that, and in general, just overall growth for the Garden. And we do that by collaborating with a lot of people around the Garden. That's staff, volunteers, the public, everyone. We are in constant contact with a lot of different stakeholders around the Garden. So that's a little bit about what we do. Through conversations, I know several of you here in the audience, and it helps that I sit nearby the education offices. But just in casual conversations, sometimes a lot of ideas just come up for story articles, for videos, or anything like that. We also are just all the time walking around the Garden, picking brains, like the staff out there and the volunteers who are out there, all of you who are engaging with the public. If you see us talking, it's because we're just kind of absorbing it all. And the reason I put this slide first before I go into a little bit more detail about everything relating to the Bulletin is because this is what the content development team does. The team of 4 that I'm part of. You see their names at the top. And it's all part of the efforts to populate an editorial calendar. So there is a bigger plan a communications plan, a marketing plan, and then that, our editorial plan kind of falls into that. We don't just pick willy-nilly, you know, like, oh, I think we should write about this today, or I think we should do this tomorrow. There's a strategy behind the messages that we're putting out, and we're always gathering ideas for timing, for the most appropriate channels that we think we should share some of these stories. And all of this goes into our editorial calendar. And it's a collaborative effort that involves different divisions around the garden, institutional advancement, public relations, all of that, and it's part of a bigger thing. So this is just a slide to kind of give you an idea of how this all fits, including the bulletin, how it fits into what content development is. But before I go on, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. Like Andrea said, I'm the managing content editor here at the Garden. I have a bachelor in journalism from Mizzou, so I love writing, as you can imagine. But I also like graphic design. My emphasis at Mizzou was magazine design. So I love to write, but I also liked telling the story through graphics. The story on the page with photos, with all the different design elements that help tell the story. So I found myself in this very fortunate position to have found the Garden. My main responsibility is the Bulletin. And the reason I show this photo is because it's very funny that a person like me who is not outdoorsy at all and has never camped, I've never been out in nature a lot because I'm not like that. But I happened to be an intern here for graphic design back in 2009, and I had never heard about the Garden before. I know it sounds awful, but I had never heard about the Garden before that. But it was one of the few graphic design internships that I could find, and I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And then, as we all know, it doesn't take long to just fall in love with this place. So I was an intern, fell in love with the place. The internship ended, unfortunately, and then I had to go back into the real world, find a job. But then I said, one day, I told my husband, I was like, one day, I'm going to go back to the Garden. I'm going to work there. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I'm going to do it. And I did. The Bulletin, the position for it is publications editor back then. It was a unique opportunity to write and design the magazine. It used to be two separate jobs, but then this opportunity came in 2012 to combine those, and I happen to have the right skills of loving to write, loving to edit, but also loving to design, so the Bulletin is my baby. This is my other baby, my first baby. The other one's at home. So I say, this is the only photo that you will find of me lying on the ground, looking at the trees, because my son William, who's now 4, this is 2 years ago, he loves nature. And one day I came back from work and he was at my parents', and he's just in the front lawn, laying on the ground, using the roots as his pillow. And he's just like looking at the trees, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So I snapped this photo because it will be the first and only time probably that you will see me lying on the ground, loving nature. I love nature. I just let my son experience it for me. So that's me. But I do love nature, and I love the Garden because even if I don't enjoy going outdoors and all of that, I truly believe in the Garden's mission, and I think we all do here. That's why we're here. So there's nothing more that I love than telling the Garden's story. And that, in addition to producing the Bulletin every quarter, is my main responsibility. It's why the content team is in charge of telling the Garden's story, because we want to build that affinity for the Garden. We want to share all those great stories that make the Garden so great. We want to share them with the rest of the world. So that is my main responsibility. telling the garden story. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the Bulletin. I have found this great image in the Biodiversity Heritage Library. If you haven't checked that out, bhl.org. It's wonderful. It has a lot of different digitized resources from the biodiversity, natural history institutions around the world, and it has all of our Bulletin archives there. So this is the first volume and first issue of the Bulletin, and in the foreword it states the purpose of the Bulletin. Back then, it was only meant to be a communication channel between the garden and the public. It was to be produced monthly, and it was just kind of sharing happenings at the garden. Before then, there was only the annual report. That was the only other publication, the only publication that the garden put out with some sort of updates on the garden. So it was not until 1913 that the annual report kind of split and the Bulletin started. Back then, there was also no membership department. So there was a lot of changes that have happened since then. So today, the Bulletin has come a long way, as you can imagine, from 1913. It's not monthly anymore, it's quarterly. You receive it in your mailboxes every season. Now, you probably know it's not a calendar quarter that it is that it comes out. It's a season quarter. So we do the winter one is from December through February. The spring one is from March through May. Summer, June through August. Fall, September through November, and then we start all over again. So it's not a calendar quarter that we follow. It's a seasonal thing, because it makes sense. We're a garden. We live by seasons. We don't live by the calendar. It's also gone from being just distributed to the public to becoming a membership benefit. So not everybody gets it. Only our 47,000 member households receive it. That's one of the big changes from that past slide that I showed, that it was just a public document. Now it's a membership benefit, and it's one that our members truly love and treasure. Our membership surveys in the past couple of years have shown that they love the Bulletin. They love receiving that paper piece in the mail. Believe it or not, obviously the conversation has been had about going digital and all of that, but people still love the paper version, and we love to produce it as well because it's this beautiful coffee table piece. We put a lot of thought into that cover, as you can imagine, because we know that that's the first impression that people will get each issue when they open their mailboxes. And most importantly, I think the biggest change from 1913 to now, but most recently, is the content and goals of the Bulletin. The content has, because it's a membership benefit, it has obviously been focused on our members. What information does institutional advancement need to communicate to our members? And that's varied. That's, event information, news, accomplishments and achievements, long format features, donor recognition, giving opportunities. There's a lot that needs to be packed into those 24 pages. So the content and the goals for sure have changed since that 1913 first issue, where it was just more like, hey, this is what's going on at the garden. It's gone through a lot of changes. It's been mostly, sometimes it was like just gardening help. Sometimes it was just more like, oh, I think that it would be great to have a feature about photography, nature photography. It has just evolved, just like the garden has evolved over the past decade. The Bulletin has evolved with it, and I think where we are right now. It's a great reflection of some of the priorities that institutional advancement has as far as communicating with members. Members still see it as the primary source of information, and institutional advancement and the membership department certainly see it that way as well. So I wanted to give you guys also just a glimpse of what the life of a bulletin, of this one issue that you guys all have. How do we get here? How do we get to this lovely piece? There's a lot of planning that goes on, and that starts 3 months before it hits your mailboxes. So there's a lot of work that goes into each issue, and there's an editorial bulletin committee that involves people from institutional advancement and members in their membership department and communications, particularly just that content development team that I was talking about. We meet every quarter, 3 months ahead of when that issue will come out, and we plot out every single piece that will be in that bulletin. Every news blurb, every staff profile, every feature, we write it all out. We talk about the different priorities that institutional advancement has as far as communicating with members. So if they say, you know, we need members to know how to get their Flora Borealis tickets, we need to know, to let them know where they can get their tickets, if they need to park somewhere else, you know, all the different logistical things that sometimes need to be communicated very explicitly. Most likely it will be in the bulletin because membership knows that members are reading this. So everything from the features to the events that will be included there, they're all plotted out in this one document in that planning meeting. So for example, for the fall issue, we met 2 weeks ago, and we're already creating all of that content. So the content involves interviewing different staff members if we need them to provide information for a feature or for a news blurb. It involves gathering photos. There's a lot of work that goes into finding the right photo for that story. Now, we have a great photo library that our photo volunteers and our photo interns have built over the years, and we're always adding more to it because we have a new set of interns start each semester, and we have a wonderful set of photo volunteers who are always keeping us up to date of, you know, what's out there in the garden. We give them assignments like, oh, we just heard from the Hort staff that this plant is in bloom in the climatron. Please make sure that you go out there before this time because we need photos of that. That involves also scheduled photo shoots. So if we have an editorial photo assignment that includes staging something or scheduling a photo shoot with our researchers in the Monsanto Research Center, there's a lot going on. That it may be just one of our stops here in this life of a bulletin, but that's like a month and a half of work that goes into creating the content for the bulletin. Let's see. Then it goes into design. Like I said, I love graphic design, editorial design in particular. So as the text is starting to be finalized, I start putting it on the page, designing it, graphics, pie charts if we need to, anything like that. The design process starts. And then it goes into the proofing stages. There's about 15 to 20 people that proof the bulletin, believe it or not. I proof it before I print out that first round and look at it myself. But as we all know, the closer you are to a piece of writing, the more likely you are to miss a lot of things. And because you wrote it, you feel very strongly about some things, and you're like, no, it should be worded this way. No, it should be worded this way. But there's a lot of proofing. It's not just me. So it goes through 3 rounds of proofing, and it's members from the team in institutional advancement as well as in communication. So there's a little bit of both so that we're all making sure that the information is accurate, that grammar and spelling mistakes do not make it in, even though some of those do happen. But there's a lot of proofing that goes on. Oh, did I mention that we do a lot more proofing? There's not enough proofing that we do. I just had to put it twice because it's probably the most important step in our process, because in addition to just copy editing for grammar and spelling mistakes and all of that, we also send it around to all the different people that we interviewed, all the different people that sent us email with information. We run all of those PDFs by everyone who touched a story at some point or another, so that then they can say, yes, that it's accurate, or no, you know what, that changed, or you know what, I still am not sure about this, can we reword the details for this event, because it may change between now and the time that the bulletin comes out. So there's a lot of that back and forth and that proofing, so more proofing. And then it goes into post-production. We send it off to the printer. We work with a local printer here out there in Eureka called Symbeo. They are amazing partners. They've been printing the Bulletin for decades, and they're one of the few printers in town that have the particular equipment that's needed for printing a piece as large as this, and in terms of quantity and in terms of finishing, you know, the stitching, all of that. There are a lot of great printers in town, but there are very few, I would say a handful, if not less than that, that could handle a project this big. So we work with Symbeo, and they are our partners. Just as we have internal partners who help us put this together, the printer is just as much our partner in getting this out there, because they work with us with the paper, they work with us to make sure that the layout and the color looks great, and they also handle our mailing. So they're my best friends. I have them on speed dial because we are always working on every issue very closely. Up until the day that they receive the design files to a week later, then I go out there and proof on site the color, because we want to make sure that this piece looks as best as possible, and then they handle the mailing. And then we all receive it in the mail. That's the life of the Bulletin. It hits mailboxes, it hits the membership services desk. We have some internal copies that get distributed so that at least the offices have at least one copy for people to look at. I know Andrea receives one for just to have available for you guys to look at whenever you're here. And then we start all over again. Actually, before we start all over again, we do a happy dance, because there's a lot of work that goes into it, as you can imagine. So 3 months worth of work, and then when I open the box that gets delivered here and I get to see that, I really do a happy dance. She see me doing a happy dance. Yes, because you're like, whew. And then like the next day after the issue is delivered, that next day our editorial meeting is planned for the next issue. So there's never it's just a constant cycle. So that's just the life of a bulletin. But I also wanted to give you an idea of what's beyond the bulletin. The bulletin right now has become the primary driver of all of our content. So like I said at the beginning, there's this editorial calendar that we create, not just for the bulletin, but for all of our content. More specifically for the bulletin, for example, we meet in November-ish, December-ish, and we plan the next year's bulletin editorial calendar. We plot out big themes that we want to communicate. So if we know that there's a big event coming, or if we know that there's a big anniversary coming, we will plot that out in a year-long editorial calendar for the bulletin. But that also informs our editorial calendar for other channels. So for example, our Discover Plus Share blog. If you haven't checked that out, I would highly, highly encourage you to go see what's out there. It's discoverandshare.org. The and is the spelled out and, no ampersand. And I know Andrea shares some of the blog posts there, but I would highly encourage you to check that out on a regular basis, because the reason that blog came to life is because I would come back from doing interviews with staff for a Bulletin article, and I would tell the team, oh my gosh, I just had the best conversation with so-and-so, and this and this and this. And then I started writing the article, but I can only fit so much in 24 pages. In fact, for an article or for a news piece, I can only fit so much in 2 paragraphs. But there's so much more to that story than those 2 paragraphs. I do my best to communicate the highlights and the most important things, but as you know, there's so much more to share with the public about each of the garden stories. So, but there was no other channel where all of those stories could go. A story would live and die with each issue, and unless we went back and revisited that same story maybe in a future issue, that would be the end of it. We would have no other ways of sharing it other than maybe sharing it with education, so that then they could pass it on to you guys, to all the different instructors, everything. So we created the Discover and Share blog to be our life beyond the Bulletin, the stories beyond the Bulletin, and the stories that, as we know, there are many stories that are more interactive, more visual than you can see on a piece of paper. So 2 years ago, Cassidy Moody, if you haven't met him, or you probably will be at some point because he's out there all the time, joined the garden as our digital media specialist, and his primary task is to produce videos for the garden. So if you have noticed that there have been more videos that are put out on our social media channels or on the blog or on the website, it's because of Cassidy. So that was a priority that we identified 2 years ago when the content team was created. We knew that the future of communication is video. So the blog also allowed us to have a place for those videos to live and to tell that deeper story beyond just the words. Cassidy and John Dedeke, our senior digital media editor, are also primarily in charge of populating the blog with different entries. We get help also from public relations, and sometimes we have guest bloggers from around the garden. We have Susie Kovaldick, who is our library conservator, if you haven't met her, but she's in the library. She has a recurring series of blog posts that she just says from the library. Here's what's happening at the conservation lab in the library. The Kemper Center blog has now shifted to be here, so gardening help will come here as well. So I would highly encourage you to check that out. And a lot of times you'll also see Bulletin articles that get translated to a blog post, because we know that then we can reach new or different audiences by sharing something that members have already read. Members get priority because they get to read it first, but then we start trickling some of that content out into the public through our blog, sharing that online. So for example, right now, the main feature on the Whitaker Wildflower Garden Anniversary, which is the main feature in the current summer issue, just got posted as a blog post. Members have already had like 3 weeks to read it. They already got it first. They got to see the content first, and now we get to reach yet another audience by sharing it on our blog. And obviously social media, that kind of goes along with what I was saying. We're sharing a lot of the stories through there. The Bulletin is also the guiding document when we're creating our marketing campaigns. We recently started focusing on 4 different campaigns per quarter. One mission-related, one attendance-related, one for the Butterfly House, and one for Shaw Nature Reserve. So this quarter, through the end of June, for example, the marketing campaign for the Butterfly House is doing 20 things we love about the Butterfly House. And each week we're putting on social media one reason that we think that the Butterfly House is awesome. And it's for 20 weeks leading up to Founders Day in September, which you probably will hear more about that later. But the Bulletin served as that guiding document because, as you probably saw in this summer issue, we have a whole feature on the history of the butterfly house. So you can see like there's a lot of crossover. We try to make those connections, but again, this is our driving force. There's other digital marketing as well, like ad campaigns that will translate sometimes from the bulletin, and there's just so much more. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the bulletin, like the life of the bulletin, not only within itself, but beyond. And that's the bulletin. Thank you. Do you have any questions? I know you have questions. Yes.
Is there some kind of prescribed balance between, in the bulletin, the emphasis on what's going on at the garden, the three entities of the garden, and what the garden does as far as research?
Yes. So that's an excellent question. So before I came along in 2012, I know research was part of some of the stories that were included in the bulletin. When I came along, I personally started getting more interested in what our research division was doing, and I started pitching more and more of that to be included in the bulletin. And as the garden has switched from that unseen garden side, which I think was it was the old way of thinking as far as what our research division was. It was called the unseen garden. It's like, oh, never mind us, just let us, we're saving the world, don't worry, we're saving plants, you won't see us, to becoming more open about research. That has also translated to this. We have a dedicated section called Research News where we put what our horticulture and research divisions are doing as far as plant conservation. That's very much intentional. We separated that from news and from events and all of that because we knew that that needed to be a dedicated thing. And that also reflected what the member survey was saying. Members wanted to hear more about research. And then the features themselves over the past, I would say, well, at least since I started in 2012, have been trying to be more research focused, weaving all of those stories together. What we found out, I don't know if you guys noticed, but in 2016 we redesigned the bulletin. It was no small change. It was like a complete overhaul of the design of the bulletin. And one of the many reasons, there were a lot of reasons why it needed to be redesigned, but one of the many reasons was this realization that a lot of our research stories were not just of the research division. They didn't involve just the one researcher or a one project. As you can imagine, or as you've heard from some of the stories that you're sharing with our public, a lot of the work that we do involves someone from horticulture, someone from research. Education then goes and shares it in their classes, and then it goes back into a cycle of, So there was the old format of the bulletin, which reflected also the way that the garden was approaching that back then, was very much like, this is what education is doing, this is what research is doing, and this is what horticulture is doing. This new design allowed us for those features to be cross-pollinating, we call them. So it's not like we'll ever call a feature, this is our research feature. We will pick a topic where our content development is now more topic-based or theme-based. So if we're talking about invasive plant control, we know that involves researchers, but we know that involves our horticulturists. So the feature itself maybe not as obvious or as explicitly called out research in invasive species, or focusing only on what our scientists are doing. It'll be more like, here's what the garden, big capital D, capital THE, the garden, is doing about invasive species, and that will be very heavily worded with research and all of that. So it's a very conscious decision that we have made over the past few years as far as including more research, but that doesn't mean that it will always be very front and center, if that makes any sense as far as the wording goes. And the other big thing that has been a very conscious decision from the membership side is that they want to connect those research stories to the public, especially if they can visit on site. So they'll pair it with a, hey, you loved reading about this, check out the member speaker series. We've lined up so-and-so to talk about this topic. So they're doing a lot of that, like read about even what our scientists are doing in Madagascar, but you can come and see our Indian Ocean display bed in the Climatron. So there's a lot of more intentional promotion of both on-site, what's happening at the garden, and connecting it to what people may not see, which is most of the research. I hope that answers your question. That was very long. Yes?
Other than the Discover and Share, is there any place where the previous editions are archived online, and is there any way to get the bulletins online instead of archived?
Yes, so the bulletin also gets sent via email about a few days or the week of that it hits mailboxes. So everyone who has signed up for those membership emails will get an electronic copy by email, unless you opted out of those emails. Or if you opted out of receiving your paper copy, some people have opted out of receiving the paper copy and receiving only the electronic version. The membership page on our website, mobat.org/membership, has a sidebar on the bottom right that has, I think, up until 3 years worth of bulletins. So you can download the PDFs there. And then, like I said, BHL has all of them. The only thing is with BHL, we are always an issue behind. And that's on purpose because we do want our members to have that exclusive feel to it. So what's archived on BHL is always an issue behind. But they're all there. And they're high-resolution PDFs, so it's not like you'll be squinting to look at them. Yeah.
Andrew, I have a question.
Yes.
If there's a volunteer, whether someone in this group or anyone that maybe has an idea for a story or would like to share something that they've experienced that maybe Bulletin fit for the Bulletin, what's the best channel to get them? What would you prefer in terms of
an email? And my email is basically just my name, andrea.andre@mobat.org. Email is the best form of communication for me because I'm in and out of my cube all the time, and phone messages, sometimes I can't get to them right away, but email is the easiest way. And I've always said, and I'll tell you what I tell all the staff here, because a lot of times people sometimes feel like, oh, I don't want to bother her with this, or I don't, this is not important. This is what I do every day. Like, who cares if I'm doing this? That's my job. That's what we hear a lot from staff. And I will tell you what I tell them. If I'm the internal beat reporter for the garden, I'd rather have more emails and delete them or say a thank you, but maybe next time, than not have that information at all. Because what we like to think of ourselves in the content development team is we can make connections between people, between stories, that may not be so obvious to the people who are, in the weeds doing the work. If I find out that so-and-so is doing this and then so-and-so is doing this, but they don't know that they're working on something very similar, but I hear it, I can make that connection, and then we can write a story that has a bigger impact about what the garden is doing. So send me an email. I can't promise that we will do something with it right away, because like I said, there's an editorial calendar that gets set almost like a year in advance, and even for each issue, we're working 3 months ahead. But that's not to say that I have had bulletin notes or story ideas that we revisit maybe a year later, and we're like, do you guys remember that so-and-so told us about this and this and this? Let's check in on that. So an email is always the best way of communicating story ideas. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. There's not, it is produced out of the communications division. It is mainly done by our creative services team, because what they do is then they take all of that content that education, Jen Smith's team is putting together as far as all of those classes. I proofread it. We sometimes kind of like pick out a class. If it's a new class, we'll say, oh, that would be kind of cool to promote on social media or anything like that. But as far as like a lot of cross promotion with the bulletin, there's not that much unless there's something that we think. So for example, the Native Plant School is the one of the many offerings at Shaw Nature Reserve. And when we were putting together the feature on the Whitmire Wildflower Garden and talking about the importance of native plants, we knew right away that we wanted to call that out. So then we go to the class catalog and make sure that everything lines up as far as timing, because that's the other thing. Sometimes classes get full by the time the bulletin is hitting mailboxes. So we have had, even though we have the best intentions, when we've promoted some classes, by the time the bulletin hits mailboxes, because we went to press like 2 weeks before that, and because we had to set the content finally like a month before that, between that final edit of the bulletin and hitting mailboxes for people to actually do anything about that class, we had some issues in that it was already full by the time, and then we're just upsetting members and readers. So there's not as much as like individual classes being called out, but in the spring bulletin and in the fall bulletin, we always make sure to include in the what can you do section in the front of the book, we always have a, hey, class registration opens February 1st or August 1st. Go check it out. And we don't call out a specific class so that then we don't run into it's full by the time it hits mailboxes.
Thank you.
Thank you.